So once again, welcome everyone. I'm Irini Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in the US, and our mission is to provide free resources and support to teachers and learners of Homer and ancient Greek texts in translation and occasionally Roman. In addition to hour-long seminars like this one, we run a 12-week course on the Iliad in the fall and the Odyssey in the spring, and we continue to develop new courses by request. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or would like to request a program. And I will pop my email into the chat as well as our website. Today, I'm very, very happy to welcome Lisa Doyle. Lisa is a final year PhD student in the Department of Classics at Trinity College Dublin and a graduate fellow of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is Trinity's Arts and Humanities Research Institute. She holds a BA from TCD and a master's from the University of Edinburgh. And she has recently published an article in Mnemosini on the late antique orator Libanius. But her doctoral research focuses on scholia, which are explanatory comments found in the margins of manuscripts. She is working on the funded project Margins of Learning, exploring the scholia on Apollonius's Argonautica. So Lisa, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Irini. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Dublin, which is where I'm zooming in from. Let me just get my PowerPoint up on the screen, and we will go to full screen there. Great, so that looks okay to everyone. Everyone can see that. Great, and I'm going to move the lovely faces just over to the right. Perfect. So yeah, thank you, Irini, for the introduction. I will be talking to you about scholia today, this is the focus of my research. And what I'm going to be talking to you about really is one of the kind of ways I think we can understand this kind of material. We're going to start with some introductions to scholia, to Apollonius of Rhodes. But what I'll be telling you essentially is that the way we can understand this material is in terms of lists and catalogues. And that's how I think the information in the scholia is being organized. So let's get started. So first, an introduction to Apollonius of Rhodes. His epic poem is the Argonautica. So this is a Hellenistic epic. Apollonius was working in the Museon, or the Library at Alexandria. He was the chief librarian there. His epic poem is, of course, very much influenced by the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Apollonius's poem is informed by the scholarship he was undertaking at the Museon in Alexandria, and it would go on then to be influential over later epics such as Virgil's Aeneid. So just as a diagram, this is perhaps oversimplified because I don't want to do an injustice to the epics that aren't included on this, but just as a way of illustrating how this works, we have Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. As a rough date, we have the 8th century BCE. Apollonius's poem then comes along the mid-3rd century BCE. It's our only extant epic from the Hellenistic period. Other epics were being composed. There were other epics written on the Argonautica, such as the one by Cleon of Curion, but Apollonius's survives extant. It was influenced by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and then in turn was hugely influential on Virgil's Aeneid. So what Virgil was doing is he was reading Homer, he was reading Apollonius, but he was also reading the scholarship or the scholia written on Homer and Apollonius. So that was one of the ways you could demonstrate your learnedness and your abilities as a scholar poet, is that you are not only reading the poetic tradition, but you're reading what scholars and commentators had to say about that as well. So the same applies to Apollonius. Apollonius was influenced, of course, by the Homeric poems, but he was also avidly reading Homeric scholarship. He was a Homeric scholar, and he engaged in some diatribes and some discourses with other scholars working at Alexandria, who were also editing the Homeric poems, because this is when we have these editions being produced as well. So, an introduction to scholia. Scholia are essentially comments found in the margins of manuscripts. Okay, they survive and are preserved in medieval manuscripts. So, this is the lovely Venetus A, containing the Iliad and the Iliad scholia, dating to the 10th century. But oftentimes, these scholia derive from commentaries that were written much, much earlier. So, with the Homeric scholia, we are given the names of 4 commentators, and this also happens with the Apollonius-scholia as well. So there's, of course, always questions about authorship. There's such a long transmission with these comments, but they are deriving from an earlier commentary tradition. They are just preserved in the margins of the medieval manuscripts, which also preserve the poems for us. So we can see, and I might see if I can, yeah, I'll just use my mouse here. So we have the Iliados, we have the poem in the middle, and the scholia, it's marginalia, it's everything occurring in the margins. Okay, so scholia are specifically comments. Marginalia can also include images and ornate doodles. Essentially, the scholia are the comments, but as you can see, there's quite a lot to work with there. So that's the Homer scholia. They are a big part of my work as well, because as I mentioned, Apollonius was a scholar. He was engaging with other Homeric scholars. The scholars who wrote the scholia that I look at, they were engaging with other scholarly discourses. So really, I'm thinking about ancient Greek scholarship here. So to talk to you about the Argonautica-scholia, which is what I'll be focusing on today. So as I mentioned, with the Homeric scholia, they derive from earlier commentaries. With the Argonautica-scholia, they derive from a dry-manner commentar, so a 3-man commentary. And we are told this in the subscriptio at the end of the manuscript. We are given these 3 names: Theon, Lucilius of Tara, which is in Crete, and Sophocleos. So we are told that the scholia derive from the commentaries of these people. Within the main body of the scholia, throughout as you're reading the notes, 2 other commentators are mentioned, an Irenaeus and a Charis, who was, we believe, contemporaneous with Apollonius. So this is someone who was also active at the same time as Apollonius in the mid-3rd century BCE. And I should clarify as well, we don't have an exact date for Apollonius, and there's a lot of discourse about with these Hellenistic poets such as Callimachus and Theocritus, is who comes first, essentially. There was a lot of cross-pollination. The Apollonius-scholia have been neglected in scholarship. So the study of scholia has really taken off in the past decade or so. Inevitably, that focus will always land on the Homeric scholia, and for good reason. It's a vast, vast corpus of ancient scholarship. The Argonautica-scholia have not received the same attention. They're a little different to other scholia. So there's been work done on essentially what we would call literary criticism, because this is our term nowadays, and that's essentially what the scholia scholia are dealing with. That they're multifaceted. It's a varied body of material, but oftentimes we can understand that material in terms of literary criticism, as we would call it nowadays. You do get some of that in the Argonautica-scholia. But you also get a lot of notes that deal with mythology and mythography, which I will explain more in a moment. And for that reason, I think they've kind of been overlooked. So I've included 2 images there. The Carl Vendel's published edition of the scholia in 1935. Guy Leschenault then produced an edition with an introduction in 2009. But apart from that, not a lot has happened. In terms of the manuscript edition, so I've shown you already an image of from one of the manuscripts containing Homeric scholia. The main manuscript for the Apollonius-scholia is the 10th century as well, and we'll be seeing some images of that later on. So again, we have 10th century manuscript. These names of these commentators we can date to late Hellenistic and early imperial periods. So 1st century BC to 2nd, 3rd century AD. It doesn't help. There's Theon. There's quite a few Theons in antiquity, but we think it's the same Theon who was also commenting on other Hellenistic poets, and not Aelius Theon, who came a bit later. So we have late Hellenistic, early imperial period. The scholarship on Apollonius's poem started in the Hellenistic period. There's not as much of a gap. With the Homeric poems, they come from an oral tradition, and the commentaries start later on. Apollonius is a scholar engaging with other scholars, including that work in his poem, and pretty much straight away, the commentary on his poem starts. So let's see what we have up next. So really what I'm going to be talking you through today are some examples which, as I said, demonstrate, in my opinion, that the information and the knowledge and the material in the scholia is organized in terms of lists and catalogues. And the examples I'm going to take you through are roughly divided in terms of landscape and how the commentators and Apollonius respond to various features of the landscape, and how they respond to the fact that Apollonius's poem is what we would say a travel narrative. So it is influenced by the Iliad and the Odyssey. It has questions of heroism at its core, but it's also concerned with the voyage of the Argo and the Argonauts as they travel around. Apollonius is including in this voyage the latest up-to-date information on the oikoumene, on the inhabited world, coming from such literature as Periplus, so Periplus literature, voyages around, the latest information to try and map the Argonautic voyage onto essentially known locations. The interesting thing about the Argonautica and the kind of irony and the play and what Apollonius is doing, of course, Apollonius comes after Homer, but the Argonautica is set, it's the generation before the Trojan War. Okay, so Apollonius has the Odyssey, he has the latest scholarship, and scholars debating over Odysseus's exact route home, and he is setting his poem a generation before that. And many times you have the Argonauts encountering the same peoples and the same route as Odysseus did as well. So we're going to be thinking about landscapes, about mountains and rivers as landmarks. And then later on, I'm going to think about how they organize material in relation to genealogies and heroic lineage as well. So we're going to have a mix of Greek text and translation. Sometimes there's not enough room, as you saw from the images of the manuscript, there's not always enough room to have, there's a lot there to have the Greek text and the translation as well. So I will have both where possible. And there's going to be a range of notes in terms of how they vary in terms of length. And as I said, it's quite a varied corpus of scholia. Scholia in general contain a lot of variegated material. The Apollonius-scholia, we're going to be looking at some short notes, like inventories of different landmarks. And then towards the end, I'm going to finish with kind of quite a large discussion that I'll be introducing to you as well. So we're going to be thinking about mountains for a couple of minutes. And really, what I mean to do by this is to explain how Apollonius's commentators are relating to and thinking about the importance of place and space and cultural memory. What the Argonauts are doing as they're going on their voyage, they're leaving markers of their voyage in the landscape. The poem is really concerned with what we call etiology, so the explanations of causes and origins. So Apollonius is explaining the existence of a sanctuary or a cult and various things like this. They encounter various different peoples and places as well. So really what Apollonius is doing and what the commentators do in turn, because they're taking their cue from Apollonius, is they're locating myth and trying to find this balance between myth and reality. So the first note we have, and these first few examples are going to come from the Catalogue of Heroes, which is in book 1 of Apollonius's poem. And I should mention that the poem is divided into 4 books, as opposed to the Homeric epic 24 books. So this Catalogue of Heroes, the Catalogue of the Argonauts, is very much influenced by Homer's Catalogue of Ships and other catalogues, poetic catalogues, such as the Hesiodic Catalogue of Women, which I'll mention later on. So Apollonius, in this catalogue, in the poem, he's listing off the Argonauts and he's organizing the material geographically. So the commentators respond to that. So the lemma here is the bit we get from the poem, and the line is Cansus came. So this is one of the names. So we are told immediately that Cleon, so he's the author I mentioned a few minutes ago, who also wrote an epic on the Argonautica. Cleon also includes Cantus in the catalogue. But what they do then is that they relate Cantus to his father, after whom a mountain is named. So they're orienting themselves by relating it to a geographical feature, after whom the mountain in Boeotia is named. And there we go. Similarly, this is further on in the catalogue. So we have, after them in turn came Phleos from Erythraea. We are told then about Erythraea, it's a Peloponnesian city, but today it's called by a different name. So this is a big feature of a lot of mythographical writing in antiquity. the interest in name changes and the origins of a city, of a town, the foundation of it, and what it's named, if it's named after a particular person, how it came by that name, and essentially what it's known as in contemporary times. So it's where we're told where the place is situated in the mountains of Sicyon. So it's related to the landscape again. And then we are given an etymology at the end. So Dionysus himself was also called Phleus, after the abundance, the flame of wine. So this interest in naming and etymologies is quite a big feature as well. Let me go to the next one. So we have our picture of Strabo there. I'll go to the second example here first. So just to point out that, again, we can't really separate. I'm going to be talking about rivers in a second. We can't really separate. To do so is kind of artificial to try and separate topics. It's all included together. I will be arguing in a minute that rivers as geographical features are more prominent in the Scholia on Apollonius than mountains. But basically we have of the Ismenus, we are told the Ismenus is a Boeotian river. On the edge of it is located a sanctuary of Ismenian Apollo. So that's what goes back to what I mentioned a minute or two ago. The Argonauts leaving markers on their route, but also what the commentators are doing is explaining or identifying these markers as well, whether they're prompted by what Apollonius says in the poem or not. So these kind of markers in the landscape. The idea of rivers versus mountains are hugely important landmarks, and you see their prominence in the work of someone like Strabo, for instance, who wrote a work of descriptive geography. And they're very important, and you can see why, as coastal landmarks. So if you have travelers by sea, how you're identifying and orienting yourself, mountains are very important. Mountains and rivers, for that reason, as prominent landmarks, can go together. So much of the Scholia consists of short notes like this one. This is an extract from a longer Scholian, but this is the information that's comprising a lot of the and how we understand a lot of this geographical interest, how it manifests. We have simple notes like Lampeia. It's an Arcadian oros, it's an Arcadian mountain, where the river Erymanthus has its source. So we have these two landmarks occurring together. But what I'm going to look at next is that rivers specifically can be understood in terms of a catalogue, in terms of how the information on rivers is presented in the poem. So generally speaking, rivers are more prominent. If we take the word for mountain, Ordos, and Potamos, river, Potamos appears, I think, nearly twice as much as Oros in the Scholia. So although Apollonius doesn't seem to lean one way or the other throughout the poem, the Scholia, what I'm going to be arguing, contain a lot of information on rivers that I think as well is probably coming from an educational context. Because the thing with Scholia is they are intertwined with the didactic tradition. A lot of the commentators who were writing these commentaries on these poems are also involved with teaching. And so you can find information in the Scholia that comes from various levels of teaching, but the cataloguing of these geographical features is kind of a hallmark of higher level education as well. So I'm going to come to that just next. So towards the end of book 2, basically the Argonauts are, it's, as I mentioned, a travel narrative, and they've left at that point the island of Lemnos. They're making their way to Colchis in book 3. So this is where the Jason and Medea love story kicks off. And book 3 of the poem is mainly set on Colchis, and for that reason, there are much fewer comments on book 3 of Apollonius's poem than the other 3 books. So that, I think, again, is a symptom of the interest in geography and ethnography and elucidating all of this mythical historical information. What I've put on the slide here is the different rivers that are mentioned in the Scholia and when, and I've included some translations to indicate kind of the type of notes we're dealing with. What I'm arguing is that the urge to comment on these rivers and the frequency with which they're commented on, this information can be understood in terms of a catalogue. So there are 43 rivers in Apollonius's poem, and that's based on Christophe Cousset's calculation. I also counted 43 for what it's worth. 39 of those 43 rivers receive some sort of comment in the Scholia. So it can be some sort of simple statement on the location of the river, or it can be part of a wider discourse. For instance, the river Nile has really quite a long note as well. Many of these notes, so these are the names of all the rivers that are commented on. Many of these notes, they reinforce the importance of etiologies, again, which I mentioned earlier, for identifying landmarks. So we saw the example with the sanctuary a short while ago. So for instance, we have a temple of Dipsacus, and we're told about the customs that are still observed there in relation to the description of the river Phyllis, and with the river Sangarius. We are told the aition, or the cause and origin of the name, and the scholion, the commentator includes the name of the author who talks about this origin, Hermogenes. And in a lot of these other cases, we have what are called etymological etiologies. So it's the cause, the origin of the name. As I said, that interest in naming is really important. So what these are doing, and these stories are doing, is lending a wider importance to these landmarks, and they're kind of anchoring myths to realia, essentially. And as I said, trying to, and this is how they're understanding and the commentators are orienting themselves in relation to all of this mythical historical material in Apollonius's poem. So here's another slide just to indicate how prominent all these rivers are and how we can understand. So a lot of the notes, it'll just have the name of the river and the place it's from. So Ilissus, Potamos Atticus, an Attic river. And I've included some images from the manuscripts there. So this is just some examples from books 1, books 2, book 3, and book 4. As I mentioned, book 3 would have a bit less because the Argonauts are on Colchis with Medea. They're not currently traveling. And book 4. This kind of organization of material then is quite similar to what we see in 2 papyri. Pedagogical papyri, because they come from the schoolroom. And the first one there contains, the Cairo papyrus contains rivers that are also a list of rivers that are also familiar from Apollonius, like the Sangarius River, which I just mentioned, Peneus, the Rhindacus River as well. And then this is quite a well-known, the Library of Alexandria also contains catalogues as well. So really what I'm trying to say is that, and this is one way it manifests, this geographical interest, but the way the material is organized is in terms of lists and catalogues. And we can see that in a schoolroom environment, that the way students and the way readers of epic poetry and other forms of literature were orienting themselves with all this information was through lists and catalogues. There has been a fair amount of work done recently on the importance of lists and catalogues in ancient Greek literature. Athena Kirk has a book, and there was also a volume by de Gruyter as well. So it happens in lots of different contexts, in poetry, in Homer, and in Hesiod, and across poetry and prose. But what I'm going to be pointing out for the rest of this talk is that this corpus of scholia in particular presents information in quite a particular way that I think can be understood in terms of lists and catalogues. As I said, they're a bit different to the Apollonius-scholia, is how I'll keep referring to them. They're a bit different to other scholia corpora. So we have catalogic groupings of material like rivers and mountains to a lesser extent. But then at the end of the talk, I'm going to be pointing out the wider organizational structure of information is also can be understood in terms of like a catalog and an encyclopedic function as well. Okay, what's next? My PowerPoint's a little bit slow. Okay, so next up, so we've moved from thinking about landscape and rivers and mountains. Now I'm going to start thinking about people and genealogies, because just as Apollonius's poem and other poetry as well is filled to the brim with, so in this case, the travels of the Argonauts, there you also have the Argonauts themselves, all the different mythological figures they're encountering. So I'm going to show a few examples, and I'll go one at a time to indicate what form these kind of notes think, because genealogy, it's like 2 sides of the same coin from the examples I was just showing. So genealogy, geography, it's different ways of conceptualizing and organizing information. For instance, Hecataeus of Miletus, who's an early Ionian prose writer, his works were essentially one work was titled Genealogies, and then he wrote geographical works as well. So there's not it's just how information and knowledge was being conveyed and understood in antiquity. Another similar author who's named Pherecydes of Athens, he only survives in fragments as well, but he is called a mythographer. But what is he concerned with? He's concerned with geography and genealogy. So the form that these notes take then, in terms of the genealogical notes, is similar to what we have with rivers and mountains and dealing with geography. You can have short notes, which just list off lineages, which I'll point out in a minute. And this, you see this in other ancient scholarly texts as well. So René Nunlist, his work will be on the list of references at the end. He argues for the existence of what he calls an index of heroes. So we see in the Scholia on Homer, for instance, that there's a points to the existence of at least an index or a catalogue of heroes or mythological figures that have the same name. Nunlist thinks that there were Alexandrian scholars for sure probably had a similar index, not just for characters of the same name, but for the various mythological figures that you kind of encounter in epic poetry. So what I'm going to point out with these examples is this, again, urge and the way that as Robert Fowler says, the way a reader or someone can get their bearings, literally. So we've just gotten our bearings geographically, but now it's getting our bearings genealogically. A figure, a person is named in a poem. What do the commentators do? They list off the heroic lineage of that person. So if we go to the bottom left of the slide here, so this is a note from, again, book 1 of Apollonius's poem. So what Apollonius has said is, he's mentioned Pylos, the city of Nestor. And what the commentator here does is he clarifies, yes, that is the city where Nestor was from. We have our river again. It's sandy because of the river that runs alongside it. Then Neleus, from his union with Chorus, had essentially the following children. And he lists off all of the children, all 12 of them. How does he finish? He finishes by saying, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back there. I hope you can see that okay. And the poet says, noble Neleus once had 12 sons. The poet here is Homer. So this note is very much reminiscent, I think, of what you would encounter in a schoolroom. You list off the 12 children of Neleus, who's an important mythological figure. He's connected to a lot of the different myths that are related in book 1 of the Scholia. How do you finish that list of children? You finish with a reference to Homer to essentially validate and back up the information you've provided. Raffaella Cribiori also has done a huge amount of work, of course, on Greco-Roman education, but she points out that an author like Hesiod, for instance, frequently occurs in the schoolroom in lists of mythological figures and heroic genealogies. So it's evidence that this is what was being learned, and this is how students and readers of poetry were learning to orient themselves. The second example then I'll look at on this slide is just at the top there. So just to point out here, all Apollonius has said in book 2 is Phineus is the character, is the son of Agenor. Apollonius is not talking about Phineus's lineage at this moment, but the commentator still launches into the genealogical relationships with this with Phineus, etc. So we are told he is the son of Agenor. We are given an author. So this is something I'm going to come back to at the very end of the presentation, is how authors and citations are organized in the Scholia. We are given what we call a variant then. According to Hesiod, he is the son of Phoenix, son of Agenor. So genealogies, just like other discourses in antiquity, there can be multiple genealogies and they can coexist together. Then we're told, given 3 authors' names, Asclepiades, Antimachus, and Pherecydes say likewise. Then it finishes again with a list. From his union with Cassiopeia, daughter of Arabus, Phoenix had the following children. So that's another example of that there. To the right then of the PowerPoint, just to point out that this is not an isolated instance in the Apollonius-scholia. This kind of lists of lineages and genealogies we find elsewhere. These are just 2 brief examples from the Homeric Scholia, so the Scholia on the Iliad. And these comments occur during Homer's catalogue. So I spoke about Apollonius's catalogue of heroes. Homer has a catalogue of ships in book 2. And essentially what the commentator does, he takes the name that's mentioned in the poem, Sthenelus and Euryalus here, and then he works backwards and he goes through the male ancestry until he arrives at Sthenelus. So we have Sthenelus. Okay, we start from Megapenthes, son of Proteus, from whom came Anaxagoras, from whom came Hipponus, from whom came Capaneus, and then from whom came Sthenelus. And the same thing happens there in the second example. The genealogies are not just interested with heroes, although heroes are mythical, they're also interested with truly mythical figures in terms of mythical beings such as giants. So what I have here is an example concerned with Titius, the mythological giant. A lot of the accounts in antiquity will focus on his punishment in the underworld. So like Sisyphus, he was condemned to a horrific punishment. But what the commentators are concerned with here is his genealogy. And really what they're trying to do is solve a problem. And this is what you get a lot in this kind of scholarship. So it's just to point out what's included in these notes and really the kind of questions that commentators are asking of Apollonius's poem. The problem is that they're confused as to who exactly is Titius's mother. So we are told Alara is the mother of Titius, but there's another tradition in which he was essentially given birth to or brought up by Gaia, the earth. And what I wanted to point out in these two notes is the interesting vocabulary that's used, and also to point out the amount of space that's devoted to the topic. So again, it seems a little strange providing these passages out of context. I will, in my final example in just a moment, have images from the manuscript, but just to stress, these comments are occurring in the margin. So there is a space constraint, but there's a lot of time and attention devoted to this kind of topics. So we have great Titius. Alara is the mother of Titius. After the death of his mother, it is said he was brought up by Gaia, just as Homer also relates. So that's your go-to, is relating what Homer says. Pherecydes, he's the author I mentioned a few minutes ago, says that Zeus had intercourse with Alara and then pushed her underground when she was pregnant because he was afraid of Hera being jealous. And then Titius was sent up from the earth after that. So that's why perhaps he's called Earthborn. You'll notice that's line 760 in book 1b. Immediately after that, so this is C, this is kind of this is the divisions made by modern editors, but it all occurs together in the manuscript. We have the same thing again. Alara is the mother of Titius, who was pregnant by Zeus. Here we're told she lacked the strength to give birth because of the enormity of her son, because of the tradition that he's actually a giant. But then they say the story that Gaia gave birth to Titius secondarily, like a second time, because you can't be born a second time, although Athena and Dionysus were, seems unconvincing and unbelievable. And the words in Greek here, apithenos kai apistos. So that's quite strong language, and it doesn't occur a whole lot in the Apollonius-scholia, especially in comparison to other works of ancient scholarship, like the Homeric-scholia. So what the commentators are trying to do there is essentially what we'd call rationalizing myth, trying to work through it and figure out the problem. How do they do that? They do it by drawing on two poets, Callimachus, who was another Hellenistic poet, and Homer. Okay, so this is how the commentator here is forming his argument, drawing on evidence from two like huge poets, and then coming up with a solution. So we will say that the poets call beings with monstrous bodies children of the earth. Callimachus says that terrible beasts are children of the earth. Homer tells us that Titius is big. Therefore, we say that when Alara gave birth, Titius was her son because of the small size of his body, but actually he grew big and became a monstrous size. So it was invented that he had been birthed and raised by Gaia. So trying to solve the problem and using information from Homer there. The final example, and this will include an image of the manuscript just to show you what this looks like. What I'm going to finish with is actually quite a long discussion. Again, when I show you the manuscript in just a moment, it's remarkable how much space it takes up on what is called the Etesian winds. So this occurs in book 2 of the poem, book 2 of 4. The Argonauts have visited Phineus, so he was the figure I mentioned a few moments ago. They then want to leave Phineus. He's based on the Thynian coast, but they're delayed by the Etesian winds, and they're delayed for 40 days. Apollonius then provides us with an aition. So this is our word of the day with the origin and the cause of the winds. He says that it's related to the figure Cyrene, which is what I'm going to show you in a minute to finish up. Cyrene's son Aristaeus was called on by the inhabitants of Chios because the land was being scorched by the dog star Sirius. Aristeas set up a shrine to Zeus Ikmeos, Zeus the rainmaker, and Zeus, as a result, created the Etesian winds to cool the land for 40 days. I've given you a breakdown, generally speaking, of the discussion we're about to see in manuscript form. So the commentators are concerned with when the winds begin. They're concerned with what I'm going to talk about and finish up on, the foundation of Cyrene. Then they talk about Aristeas, the son of Cyrene. They talk more about the dog star. They debate the duration of the winds, and they include etymologies in there as well. So that's a very general overview because it's quite long. This is just the part I'm going to talk about. Obviously, I won't read through it all, but it's just to indicate the length of it to you. So this is just one part that's concerned with the foundation of Cyrene, just to go back. And this is what we have in the manuscript, beginning here. Eri etesii aurai. So that's the verse in the poem, all the way down and all the way around again. So this is the manuscript containing the Apollonius-scholia. So this takes up quite a lot of space and attention. At the crux of the discussion, this is my last slide, what the commentators are concerned with, again, is essentially a genealogical problem. They're talking about the foundation of the city Cyrene. So this is based in Libya. And foundation literature, the literature of foundations of cities, or Kitiseus literature, was a hallmark of the Hellenistic period. Writing literature on the origins of the cities, usually cultivating a Greek heritage for cities. I mean, again, just to reiterate, Apollonius is working, for instance, in Alexandria in Egypt. So it's kind of getting and managing and dealing with the new kind of Greek identity within the inhabited world. So what the problem here is that the commentators are dealing with is a genealogical problem, dealing with Cyrene's family, who is Cyrene's father, and then dealing with her son Aristeas and who his parents actually are. And just to point out, kakos, that's kind of a key word is used there. Some mistakenly say that Cyrene's father is this, but there's a mix-up here happening with, and as I said, genealogies, there are multiple genealogies can coexist. And what the scholar is obviously doing here is referring to a discourse that we just don't have evidence for. There's been a bit of a mix-up between what Hesiod says about Cyrene and what Pindar, the lyric poet, says about Cyrene. So drawing on a poetic tradition there, and obviously some sort of misinterpretation. What I want to take a step back and finish with is to look at essentially the list of authors that are provided here. So I've broken this note up, obviously, just to make it a bit more digestible and how we look at it. We start with Pindar, the lyric poet, and we finish with Bacchylides, who's another lyric poet. So it's interesting to think about how poets, how these authors are used and associated with one another. So we have a lyric poetry sandwich there. And then we have 1, 2, 3. We won't say that's an author, but referring to a tradition. Some say 4, 5, 6 other authors in between that. So what the commentators are doing here, and this kind of note is really quite typical of what you get in the Apollonius-scholia in general, is they're essentially, it speaks to the encyclopedic function of this material, because the commentators here are presenting with all the authors you can read on Cyrene. They are gathering them together, listing them out, and it speaks to the archiving and kind of collecting impulse that the commentators on Apollonius have. You also see this in other works of mythography in the Hellenistic and in the Imperial periods. But really, this is a hallmark of the Apollonius-scholia, is having a note with many different authors. We don't always get any preference for one author over the other, because that is what you do get in other scholia. No, what the Apollonius-scholia are doing is listing out authors, and it speaks to what Athena Kirk, what Alan Cameron and Shaw de Lettres have commented on as kind of the cultural influence and the cultural currency of Greek mythology. And the ability to gather all this information together, presenting all of this material, kind of location-based mythography. So here are all the authors you can read on Cyrene. Speaks to the function of the Apollonius-scholia, as I've been calling them, and how they might function as a handbook. One of the commentators I mentioned in one of the very first slides, who's mentioned the Scholia, Charis, who was a contemporary of Apollonius, he wrote a book on all of the myths in Apollonius. Irrespective of how much that book has informed the scholia we have today, it has been debated among scholars and discussed that mythographical handbooks were being circulated in antiquity that, you know, later poets and other mythographers would read, and that would inform their work. The Apollonius-scholia, by listing, collecting all of these authors and presenting them in this kind of archiving encyclopedic manner, I think is fulfilling that kind of function, especially since they're not really weighing up one author versus another. It's presenting, collecting, and archiving information. And with that, I believe my next slide is just the references. So I'll finish up. I hope everything was clear, but thank you for so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. Does anybody have any questions?
Should I take the screen down, or what would be
best?
Yeah,
you can take the screen down. Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
And let me,
that was really fascinating. Does anybody else have any questions? I will ask mine, but I want to give others a chance. So some of the things that I'm wondering about are this may be outside of your purview, but I'm interested in this cataloging, in this genealogy, landscape, space, and then how is Virgil taking that? Because a lot of times I'm looking at Virgil and I'm seeing the relationship to Homer, and I can see elements of Apollonius in the Aeneid, but in light of the things that you've talked about, I'm kind of interested to hear if you have anything.
Yeah, like the interesting thing about Virgil, so you know, we know that the figure of Dido hugely influenced by Apollonius's Medea. So I would go to the Scholia looking for that. There's not a whole lot of commentary there. So you think, okay, but then if you take a step back and you're thinking about the use of landscape and the genealogies, I'm sure there is more that can be said there. And that's work I haven't done. There's a book by Schlunk, who I think it's from the 70s, and it's a whole book devoted to Virgil's use of the Homeric scholia. And I think maybe a similar kind of thing maybe needs to happen with the Apollonius-scholia, because what I'm trying to do, I guess, with the PhD thesis is, because no one's really worked on it, and this corpus of scholia, and just to get the ball rolling and say, this is what's there. But yeah, as I said, going to the scholia at first, I was taken aback by, as I mentioned, of the 4 books of the poem, Book 3 contains much less comments in the Scholia, and that's the love story. That's the great depiction of the tragic depiction of Medea that we also later see in Dido. And there's not a whole lot there. So you think, God, what was Virgil reading? But I definitely think, and again, what the Scholia here are a part of is a larger kind of mythographic discourse, so that even if Virgil was or was not directly reading the commentaries on Apollonius, it's part of the commentaries, and the content was filtered into other mythographic handbooks that he definitely. So like one author, like we call him now Pseudo-Apollodorus, because it was attributed to Apollodorus, but it's the Bibliotheca, the library, so a great mythological collection. A huge amount of that has come from the Apollonius-scholia. So one way or another, Virgil was dealing with that kind of material, I think.
And do we have, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, please, that was it.
do we have a date for the Bibliotheca?
Oh, so yeah, that's a good question. I think it's early Imperial, right? Because it's later than Apollodorus. So is it 2nd century CE? I can double check it, but
I think that's what I had. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so yeah, what as I kind of mentioned briefly there, is that scholars who work on like mythography, like Alan Cameron, etc. And it's been theorized since, I think, the scholar Betha theorized it like in the 19th century or 18th century. There was a handbook or multiple handbooks in circulation that fed into these authors like Pseudo-Apollodorus, and the Scholia on Apollonius, with their listing and their cataloging, kind of have, I think, a big role in that. But they are still different from what you get. What you have in Pseudo-Apollodorus is the myths. You don't have the listing of authors. What the Apollonius-scholia are doing is saying, here are all the different variants of the myth, and here are all the authors. So yeah, I'm sure Virgil was dealing with some part of that tradition, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, it's also really fascinating to me to think about how the conversation around Homer changes in the Hellenistic. and how in the classical you have, say, Plato and the tragedians and even Aristophanes. Everyone's very hyper aware of Homer and situating themselves in relation to Homer.
Right.
But it feels like in the Hellenistic, there is a shift, this scholarship and sort of setting themselves simultaneously apart from, right, like Homer will become an object of study, but Homer will also be woven into the artworks that are created. I don't know if that is
Yeah,
correct.
oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Because you have still this idea of, and that's what a lot of debates in Alexandria are happening, is the editing away of Homer and parts of the poems that they don't find suitable. So you have scholars such as Herodotus and later Aristarchus doing that. But you still have this, I think, fundamental concept of Homer as educator. And that's what, like what you can learn from the Homeric poems, what Apollonius is doing with that, the epic poet as educator, but he's also doing kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge towards all of the different debates that were happening about Homer at the time, But yeah, it's an interesting shift, I think, once you start getting that text and you have these scholars editing it as a text and what is or is not, what is Homer? It's a big question. And then you have Callimachus saying, really the poetry should be slender, and then Apollonius comes out with this huge epic poem, and all the different debates that are happening at the time, it's all goes back to Homer essentially.
Yeah, and the idea that it's a text versus a performance piece, right? And that it has to be fixed in some way. And their concerns similar to our concerns, like, can we find the original? Can we find, right? So it's interesting how far back that preoccupation.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the whole like modern debates as well about rewriting and re-editing text, that's essentially what the Alexandrians are doing, for better or worse.
Right.
But yeah, and obviously performance culture was still a thing, and Apollonius, you have poetry is still of course performed, but you have this juxtaposition of the additions, the ekdosis, the addition of a text. And yeah, so it's an interesting development, I think.
It really is. It really is. Very happy to see so much interesting work being done in it. So thank you very much for joining and sharing your expertise with us.
Nice. I was just really interested to see the beautiful images of the writing. It was, from what I could see, there was a short form of the word potamos. There was like a pie, and so you've all that to deal with as well, do you? Lots of short forms and that sort of thing. I don't really have a question, but it was just fascinating to say that.
Thank you. Like, first of all, I'm very lucky in that. So again, the work I'm doing, it's trying to like lay a groundwork with the scholia. As I said, people have not really been working on them. There is a published edition, that image I showed on the screen from 1935, and the recent French one, which is the same text. So that's what I work with, because to get lost down a rabbit hole of like textual questions without having done like core work on really to see what the scholia are doing in the first place, like once you lay that groundwork, then later you can get lost down, oh, the edition says this, but the manuscript says this. And what you have with the editions is that so the manuscript I was able to show, it's digitized. So the Laurentius manuscript L is in a library in Florence, but they've digitized it and it's brilliant. So the accessibility is great. And I'm able to go and check things out, because what you do have with the published editions is that the editor will have changed something because he doesn't think it looks right or sounds right, or he wants to, or whatever. So then I can go back and check. And so you're dealing with paleography and all that stuff as well, which I kind of did a crash course on, but it's great. And once you get used to kind of the style, which develops across the centuries, and once you get used to, what you're looking at, it's not so bad. And it's always great, like keeping in mind just always the physical context and not getting removed, because it's really important. So I'm really lucky the manuscript's digitized and I'm able to do that. But with the editions, like there's a lot of messing around with the scholia. Like the last example, the Etesian Winds, which I showed, was huge. The way you read it in the published edition, they have it in a different order to the way it is in the manuscript, because I suppose it makes more sense. But like, at what point are you, you know, I don't know, it's just an interesting question. The kind of anachronistic aspect of, you know, because they remove, a lot of the time they remove repetition and stuff. So you'll have discussions. I was speaking about the interest in names and etymology and the former name of something. That, and you know, there's one note I was looking at recently where the original name of a place is repeated. They open with it and they come back to it, and the editor's taken that out. But it makes perfect sense that that's there because that's how they, you know what I mean? And that's what I mean about other kind of handbooks on mythography from the imperial period and stuff. It's, you start with the name and then you work from there in the previous name. And although it's a bit clunky and awkward, that's scholia. It's not poetry. It's not, you know, high form literature. It is what it is. So I feel like we just need to take it for what it is. And that's why the manuscript is quite helpful to always be going back to that. And it's beautiful. So yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic that you can actually, you can look at that online,
yeah,
compare it with the published, you know, that's fantastic.
Yeah, oh, it's wonderful, because otherwise I think I'd be tearing my hair out. And I'm lucky as well, because if I was working on the Homeric-scholia, there's a vast manuscript tradition, and it's a lot. And I mean, all manuscript traditions are quite complex. I can barely get my head around it. But the primary manuscript is the one for the Apollonius-scholia is the one I was showing. So I think it's a bit more self-contained, because the Homeric manuscript tradition for the poems is just a bit of a mess. And so you have all these different scholia as well. So I'm very lucky that it's more self-contained and that it's beautifully digitized. So yeah, it's great.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Anyone else? Any other thoughts?
Yes.
Yeah.
How did these writers in the past transmit the scholia? Were they just notes they put in on the side for themselves? Or did they purposely put them in there to speak to another writer?
That's a great question. I would say, and I'm going to be awkward, the answer to that is kind of both. So first of all, if we go back earlier than our 10th century manuscript, in our papyri, which survive from Greco-Roman Egypt, you have marginalia, you have scholia on those. Again, also papyri from like an educational context in a schoolroom. With these commentaries though, so we're told that the scholia come from these three commentators. They existed in the form of a commentary, and they were gradually filtered down and combined and digested, essentially. So that's the problem we have with the authorship. We have the names of commentators, but you know, we can't say, oh, this comes from, you know, this comes from this one. Like I had meant to say actually during the presentation when I was talking about Titius, like the giant and his genealogy, there's a similar discussion happening in the Scholia on Pindar, the lyric poet. And in that situation, we can see why that happened, because the same commentator, Theon, was also commenting on Pindar. Now, that's all we can say. So we can identify, and what I was trying to indicate there is types of discussions and what kind of questions are being asked. But my objective is not to go and say, okay, this person wrote this commentary, because it's a futile effort. But so the answer is, you kind of have both going on, and then you have a kind of filtering down process that happens. But the commentaries would have existed hupom nemata. They were produced, commentaries were produced like that, and that's kind of how they existed, but gradually became digested and filtered away. And who are they for? They're for, again, it's this educational context. They're being read at I guess higher level education. They're being read by other scholars and commentators, and they're being read by poets as well. So like I use Virgil as kind of the most well-known example. There's other poets from the later later imperial period. You know, like there's a poet called Oppian, and then Pseudo Oppian, who's writing about fish and writing about hunting. One of my colleagues in Trinity just finished a PhD in Oppian, and it was very clear from his work that Oppian was reading Scholia as well on Homer. So as I said, a measure of your ability as essentially a poet and a scholar poet is not only engaging with the poetic tradition, but engaging with the scholarly tradition as well. And so these scholars and commentators had great cultural weight in antiquity with these commentaries that they were producing, which are being used by students and being used by, poets as well, I think.
Thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I'm struggling even just to verbalize some of these questions, because it does feel like we don't. I've been reading a little bit about the commentaries as well on Homer, and some of the debates among scholars about which scholia to emphasize, and how some of them become kind of marginalized. And it's interesting then to think in terms of what kind of questions are these scholars asking, and maybe even some of our own predilections, and why we gravitate towards some, or we want to give more weight to some versus others, I think is also a question. Yeah.
Totally. And that's why scholia were, I think, neglected for so long. Like, obviously, the initial, when you have a manuscript perfectly preserving a poem from antiquity, you're going to go to that first, because like the same manuscript, L, that contains the Apollonius's poem, and the scholia also has the plays by Sophocles and Aeschylus with scholia as well. But then you have a tradition of essentially scholars using scholia in quite a bitty manner and kind of mining them for what you want. So the authors, if the last example I showed with the list of authors, those are fragmentary authors. So that reference to them is referred to as a fragment, because we don't have the author's work in full. So that reference is a fragment. So instead of authors or scholars looking at scholia or one comment, one scholion in its entirety, if you're looking at the fragments of Euripides or Pherecydes, the author I mentioned, you find the scholion and you take just the bit you need, the bare minimum, whereas the surrounding context can actually be quite informative as well. So it's kind of mining scholia. And then when you do engage with scholia, a lot of time the discourse is, well, they're wrong, or they say silly stuff. And yeah, but like, so, like it's kind of, you have to take, I think, like a warts and all approach, you know what I mean? Because really it's telling us a lot about like the history of education, the intellectual tradition, but also, of course, because the way we think about things is different to the way, the ancient Greeks thought about things, and that's okay. So yeah, I think people have treated scholia kind of as like an ancillary process, and it's just then it's a secondary activity to consult scholia, and you only take what you need, and really what it takes is just people to spend time with them, you know what I mean? So that's what's happening now, is that scholia are becoming the focus themselves, because I think more work is being done just on ancient scholarship in general, but scholia are a big testament to that, and there's a lot there. When we think of like marginalia and scholia and glosses, you can get like sparse, short little notes, but I think, as I showed, there's quite a lot there as well. There's really big discussions that need to be unpacked. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be said, but it's changed. People are, I think, realizing that now, which is good. But there's still so many different scholia, corpora and stuff that, probably need to be worked on as well.
Yeah, and I would imagine, I got this a little bit from reading about the Venetus A, that even things like it's interesting to think about how the printing press would have also made scholia feel difficult to digest, because now you can't portray it the way that it was in past right. You aren't seeing, as you showed us in the image with all the writing, and even sometimes how I feel like I read this about the Venetus A, how even the commentary on the manuscript has a logic in how it's put on the page in ways that would just never occur to us reading text.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's why, the physical context is hugely important. And yeah, the printed editions, digesting that and getting rid of that is a problem. And then you have, it's a hard one to replicate, because then you have the editions just containing scholia, which is okay, because that's how they once existed, as commentaries in and of themselves, right? But then you have problems with that as well, and what's being left out by editors and stuff like that, you know. And even in works that, you know, modern scholarship that are concerned with scholia, like sometimes, you know, you can be reading someone writing about scholia, and they don't include still like all of the information, or they won't include something simple like the lemma, which is the quote from the poem or the text that's being commented on. And that's kind of important because it tells you a lot as to what's prompting the discussion. Yes. So,
I should say so.
Yeah, right. And so that speaks to the physical context as well, because that's related to, you know, what's being commented on. So yeah, it's a tough one, but it's good that these conversations are happening and these questions are being asked anyway, because people are thinking about it more. But yeah, I think it's just so important just for thinking about like knowledge and kind of intellectual endeavors just in ancient Greece and Rome, because scholia are a huge part of that. For the poetry we read as well, they had a big part. Scholia as they exist now, but the commentaries as they did exist, you know. So yeah, it's worth looking into, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. Really enlightening.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So yeah, any other questions or thoughts before we close? Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I hope you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I love that a lot.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. You're so kind. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Hope to see you again.
Yeah. Thank you. See you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.